Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about the structure of a nerve cell, or as it's scientifically called, a neurone. And we'll talk as well about what the synapse is and what happens at a synapse. So the picture that I've got here on this front screen is of a basic nerve cell. So we're just going to talk through all of the bits. The nerve is one of about 210 or so specialised cells in the body. So it has very particular parts with particular functions. So just going to annotate this. If we just think back to early key stage 3, and you're showing the basic sort of structure of an animal cell. It's that kind of round cell with a basic cell membrane and nucleus. That's kind of what we have here. All of this top part in green is that kind of basic cell. And this part here is referred to as the cell body. So I'll just write that in here. So the cell body is this entire sort of green section, typical cell structure. And if we think back to a basic diagram, this part here, the sort of black outline, if you like, this is our basic cell membrane. Now the cell membrane, usually we say it controls what goes in and what goes out of the cell, and that is true. Specifically in a nerve cell, the cell membrane actually has channels that let sodium and potassium in and out, and that actually leads to the sort of the impulse or the electrical signal that gets transmitted down the nerve. It's its means of communicating with another nerve, or essentially having one body part communicate with another. So the cell membrane controls what goes in and out, but specifically it has sodium and potassium channels that help to transmit a nerve impulse down this nerve. And you can see labelled in blue here, so I'll just write it in the blue, this big blue dot here is the nucleus. And the nucleus in any cell controls a cell's activities. Now, imagine you were to physically grab this cell membrane and pinch a bit of it up. Now that's what these sort of parts are. That cell membrane has kind of been pinched upwards, and it has some branches coming off it. And that section there, so that bit that I've just circled in red, they are called the dendrites. We'll come back to their job in just a moment. So we've got the dendrites. Now you'll notice in purple, it's as if someone's grabbed that cell body, a section of it, and dragged it really far down. There's a really long thread-like extension of that cell body, this bit in purple, and that here we call the axon, A-X-O-N, the axon. And you'll notice that kind of axon is covered in this sort of red sheath or red protective layer. The red protective layer is known as myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath serves to protect this axon, which this nerve impulse is actually going to travel down. But interestingly, a degeneration or the destruction of this myelin sheath is thought to account for a good number of neurodegenerative diseases. So this breakdown of myelin sheath can actually lead to a number of neurological problems. Now, if you follow the axon down, so if we go this way, because when we actually generate a nerve impulse, it generates in the cell body and it gets transmitted all the way down the axon, and then it ends here where I've just drawn this star. And you can see it's ending in sort of branches or terminals. So these endings are actually called the branched axon terminals. Okay, so there's our basic structure of a nerve cell. I just want to pick up actually on one sort of point, going back to the myelin sheath. Now, it depends what sort of level you're studying nerves at, but if I just take the blue pen and just highlight that bit there and that bit there, you'll notice there's kind of little gaps between the myelin sheath. They're perfectly normal. Those gaps are perfectly normal. In fact, they are called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, you don't often hear of those, but those nodes actually help the impulse. It speeds the impulse up, essentially. It allows it to sort of jump from gap to gap. Now, we're not going to go into the sort of details of that in this, but it's just to explain where those gaps come from. So let's talk about what they do. So we said the cell body, we've got the nucleus that controls the cell, membrane that controls what comes in and out. The axon, this long thread-like extension, that's what transmits the nerve impulses. So we're really left with two key bits, the dendrites and the branched axon terminals. Now if I just go to a new page, just for a moment, so let's just insert a new slide. What I want to do is show you how these nerves relate to one another, and it will help to explain the job of the dendrites and axon terminals. Let's just take a very quick sketch. Here's the cell body, here's some dendrites, here's the axon coming off one, and here are some branched axon terminals coming off the axon. What you essentially have is one nerve communicating with another through these specific branches. It forms like one long pathway, a kind of chain of nerves. So the axon terminal here of one particular neuron branches onto the dendrites of another. So the job of the dendrites is to branch and connect to an axon terminal of one neuron, and equally the job of an axon terminal is to branch and connect to another neuron. Or in certain cases, an axon terminal branch could join to branch onto a muscle, or what's called a neuromuscular junction. Okay, so now we've talked about the nerve and its structure. I now want to talk about the synapse. Now, this area here that I'm going to colour in, we'll use purple just to have something a bit different. This area here, if we were to zoom in, would look a little bit like this. So if we were to zoom in on the bit where a dendrite meets an axon terminal, what you'd have is, if we just draw a large scale, something that looks a bit like this. Now this here at the top, this is an axon terminal. So we'll just label that axon terminal. And then there's this gap here that's forming this connection, and then this leads on to what essentially is a dendrite of another nerve. So this here is the dendrite of another nerve. Now this whole gap here, this big gap that you see there, it is that, if we just shrink this a little, just so we can make a bit more room, it is that we would call the synapse. So the synapse is the gap between those two neurons or nerves. Sometimes you see it called and written as the synaptic cleft. Now we need to put in a few key structures. So I'll draw these in and then I'll explain exactly why I'm drawing these in. Okay, so what I've drawn in this top part of the picture is these vesicles. Now there are, I'll just label that. These are vesicles, and these are little membrane-bound sacs. So just little sacs made of a membrane, and inside those vesicles is a chemical called neurotransmitter. Neuro for nerve, so it's a nerve transmitter chemical essentially. Now when an impulse, a nerve impulse, travels down this neuron, which from now on we're going to call the presynaptic nerve. Pre as in before, and synaptic is before the synapse, so the presynaptic nerve, the nerve before the gap. So when an impulse travels down the presynaptic nerve, what happens is these vesicles move down. So when the impulse reaches an axon terminal, these vesicles of neurotransmitter move down towards this membrane here, this membrane of the nerve. So this would be called the presynaptic membrane. And this vesicle actually fuses with that membrane. So we'll just draw a little vesicle there with the chemical inside. Upon fusing, that vesicle actually bursts. And the chemical, the neurotransmitter, is released across the gap, and it diffuses, just simply diffuses across the gap. And when it touches the postsynaptic membrane, so this here on the bottom, if we had presynaptic nerve at the top, this is going to be our postsynaptic nerve, so our nerve post the synapse, so after the synapse. That means that this membrane here would be the postsynaptic membrane. So when this neurotransmitter diffuses across the gap and it comes into contact with this postsynaptic membrane, the membrane of another nerve, it can trigger a receptor, so it can bind to this blue part here. So this blue part that I've labelled is a receptor on this membrane. And if this neurotransmitter chemical binds to that receptor, this site, on the nerve, on the postsynaptic nerve, then that triggers a second impulse, another impulse in this nerve, in the postsynaptic nerve, and that impulse can then travel down and then continue on. So just to recap, the impulse would travel down the presynaptic nerve, so the nerve at the top of the screen, reach the axon terminal. It will cause a vesicle with neurotransmitter to move down and fuse with the membrane, the presynaptic membrane. It will then burst and release the neurotransmitter across the gap, and that will bind with a receptor on the postsynaptic membrane. And should that happen, another nerve impulse would be generated, and that would pass down through that dendrite into the postsynaptic nerve, and the nerve impulse would continue on. Now, interesting, just a few random other little asides. There are mitochondria inside the axon terminal. Now, mitochondria are very small. I'm just going to draw them, just a very quick sketch. Small little organelles, or like parts of a cell, and their job is to essentially produce energy. So they're the site of aerobic respiration, and they would need to provide energy for this whole process to happen. So they provide energy, and that allows these vesicles in red to move down. Now notice, I haven't drawn any of the red vesicles in the postsynaptic nerve. The reason why is to ensure that nerve transmission only is one way, that it follows one path. So that's why neurotransmitter only diffuses down across the synaptic cleft, across that synapse, the gap, but nothing can go backwards, because those vesicles are only on one side, they're only in the presynaptic nerve. Okay, I hope that helps.